exciting. El Paso, Texas, gateway to the Old West, and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is May the 22nd, 142nd day of the year. Just 223 days remain to the year's over with. Holidays and observances. It's Sherlock Holmes Day. They got one of the Arthur Conan Doyle's books or watch one of the movie adaptations. Or even go out and solve your own mystery. World Goth Day. Harvey Milk Day. He was an official in San Francisco, I think. A leader in the LGBTQ group. Chardonnay Day. National Maritime Day. Bitcoin Pizza Day. National Boss Babe Day. Musical Instrument Day. National Solitaire. International Heritage Age Week. Cannes Film Festival, which ends Saturday. Be Nice to Knuckles Week. And Dementia Action Week. All that having been said, let's see what is in the news today. There's a pro-Palestinian man who's accused of murdering some Israeli embassy staffers after the Jewish Museum event last night. 2 Israeli diplomats were shot and killed during an event at the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. A pro-Palestinian man is in custody after he killed 2 Israeli embassy staff members who were leaving an event. The victims were identified as Yaron Paczynski and Sarah Milgram, who were set to get engaged. According to Metropolitan Police Department Chief, officers responded to multiple calls of a shooting near the museum about 9 o'clock last Wednesday night. When they got there, a man and a woman were found unconscious and not breathing. Despite life-saving efforts, both were pronounced dead. 30-year-old man identified as Elias Rodriguez of Chicago said who committed the act. He's in custody. His gun was also recovered. He was allegedly observed pacing back and forth outside the museum before he approached a group of 4 people who came out of the building, including the 2 victims, and started shooting. He was arrested by security officials at the museum when he entered to try to shoot some more. And he started yelling, "Free Palestine." And D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser described the shooting as horrific and said there's no longer an active threat. But she said the city will not tolerate this violence or hate. It's considered an act of terrorism. The event they were at was hosted by the American Jewish Committee. And this lunatic activity has been demonstrated by people who say they're pro-Palestinian, not only out in the community, but especially at universities, is just insane. And the group I find so fascinating are the gay supporters of Palestine. If they were there, they would be killed for being gay. But they don't seem to stop to think about that. Well, Trump's big, beautiful bill has passed the House despite rebellion within the GOP. Experts are talking about how Chinese illegal aliens are using the Canadian city as a gateway to the U.S. An immigration expert says the flow of Chinese illegal aliens into the U.S. could largely be supported by the Chinese community in a Western Canadian city, and the Chinese Communist parties using known Canadian smuggling routes to sneak operatives into the U.S. Biden officials, excuse me, delayed warning the public about hard information risks from the COVID shot. They were so adamant you had to get your COVID shot, they overlooked those little negatives. Well, Trump had an exchange with the NBC reporter who asked about the Qatari jet gift amid a meeting about genocide in South Africa. Trump and the reporter apparently got into it. This jumbo jet, which was a gift from Qatar, is going to serve as the backup Air Force One. The Pentagon made the announcement it would be accepting the jet. The questions regarding the jet were asked immediately after Trump directed the staff to lower the lights and show video footage about the treatment of white farmers in South Africa during his meeting with the African nation's president. But the reporters didn't want to talk about that. Oh no. They wanted to talk about the Qatari jet. The Illinois state lawmakers get hostile during debates about trans athletes and girls' sports. Democrats accused Republicans of being obsessed with children's genitalia as tensions mount. There was a track controversy in Naperville where the winner was a transgender male. Former New Orleans Police Department chief slams the sheriff about the checkered past in a discussion of the recent jailbreak. More 10 inmates hit the streets. Broken cities and bad governments. Blue state city residents are voting with their feet. They're leaving. The newly released data from the Census Bureau looks to be good news for big cities in the wake of COVID panic that drove residents to the suburbs beyond city populations have rebounded. 94% of cities showed population growth. But if you look closer, there's a different story. Some of the largest blue state cities, governed by Democratic mayors such as New York, LA, Chicago, and Philadelphia, continue to have lower populations than in 2020. In fact, New York City had the biggest drop from 8.8 million to 8.4 million, or 3.7%. Having lived there for 3 years, I can tell you that some of the policies, rules, and regulations are absolutely insane. Gutfield has contrasted Trump's energized team with Biden's island of misfit DEI hires. The rare northeasters are unleashing powerful winds and heavy rain across the East Coast. A House Democrat says the Ireland trip of Biden reminded him of going on a trip with a father who suffered from Parkinson's. Representative Quigley reveals observations from the trip where he witnessed former President become breathy and frail. But his staff and mainstream media continue to claim he was the sharpest Biden ever. Now, Governor Gavin Newsom claims to be protecting American jobs. through his environmental policies. Of course, the mere fact that half the state burned down is irrelevant. We shouldn't be looking at that. There's a new book out that exposes how top Biden aides helped cover up his declining mental condition. Federal judge blocks the Trump administration from firing 2 Democratic members of the Privacy Oversight Board. His firings left 1 Republican as the sole member of the board. But, federal judges are God's anointed. They know better than anybody else what ought to be. He fired 3 Democratic members of the 5-person board in February, resulting in 2 of them filing a lawsuit. U.S. District Judge Reggie Walton found allowing unilateral firings would prevent the board from carrying out its purpose. Of course, he knows better than anybody else because, as I said, he's one of God's anointed. The Democrats are having a meltdown that cutting fraud, waste, and abuse out of Medicare is going to mean people are going to die. I don't know what the logic of that position is, but that's how it is. The Biden Health Book co-author reveals the media was amazed at how well they covered up his declining mental and physical condition. Well, yesterday we were talking about what I call the UFO murders. And I just watched a couple of videos this morning about testimony made to Congress. Apparently what has been a cover-up since at least the 40s is starting to crumble. And there's a few things that have come to light about the situation that I know well, which is the Roswell situation, that I wasn't aware of. For over 10 years, I spoke every year at the Roswell UFO conference until the individual who managed to become the political master of Roswell decided I wasn't needed since I was out selling his tired, worn books almost 2 to 1. And it turns out that there was a lot of things that took place in regard to the Roswell situation that very few people knew anything about. Now, there was a mention made in a number of reports I looked at about the fact that they found alien bodies on the Foster Ranch in Lincoln County. Now, I had talked to the niece of a young man who used to be Mac Brazil's shadow. But when the military came in, they scared him so bad he went back to Mexico and refuses to even come close to the border. But he told her the story of what he had seen. And apparently, there were several bodies found in the crashed UFO. The Roswell affair and its accounts of crashed UFOs wound up being covered up after the Roswell Army Airfield announced that they had found a UFO. That was changed almost immediately to a crashed weather balloon. Now, there are a lot of fatalities that were kept out of the news, and quite a number of them were human fatalities. Now, the trauma of the encounter itself was shocking and strange, and it caused a lot of emotional distress for a number of the witnesses. There were even some suicides involved, allegedly. One of those was Vern Brazil, the son of rancher Mike Brazil, who actually found that wreckage on the ranch and told his story to the Roswell media. Now, at the time this happened, Vern was 8 years old. But while still a young age, he became a victim of the event. Now, it's generally acknowledged by Roswell researchers there were at least 3 locations on the ranch where highly strange material was found. There was the main debris site, a second location where damaged craft was found, and a third location where a number of unusual decaying and badly damaged corpses were found. Newspapers of the time reported that Vern was with his father when he came across the massive amount of debris strewn across the ranch. But apparently, he had also seen the bodies. Now, we'll never know for certain. No sooner did he reach an age when he'd leave home, he said go out of New Mexico forever and spent time in the Navy before wandering around parts of the U.S. And while still in his mid-20s, according to the story, he committed suicide. On top of that, a few Roswell researchers also claimed that Mike Brazil's death in 1963 was suicide as a result of the stress and fear provoked by encountering something so unearthly back in 1947. And among the witnesses was somebody named D. Proctor. He was a friend of Vern Brazil. At the time of the crash, he was 7 years old. And he's also acknowledged to have been involved in the discovery of items on the ranch, even alien corpses. Or, according to his mother, Retta, he also encountered something else. Now, within Roswell research, there's a belief that Dee, who used to help Mac Brazil on the ranch, even at a very young age, was present when Brazil made the discovery of one or more unusual decomposing bodies on the property. And he was so outrageously threatened by the military after the event and warned not to talk about what he'd seen. I know a number of others who claim to have been threatened with everything from life imprisonment to death. They managed to talk about what they'd seen. And this was a life-changing experience that, in fact, didn't determine the rest of his life. He died well before his time and combined results of alcoholism and an out-of-control eating disorder. Now, another one who crawled into the bottle was retired Major Jesse Marcel. I didn't have the opportunity to know him. I knew his son. Now, he was the base intelligence officer at Roswell, helped to recover at least some of the debris from the site, and became the fall guy in the government's operation to keep everything under wraps by claiming that what he had found was nothing stranger than a weather balloon. You would think as an intelligence officer he'd know the difference between a weather balloon and something else, but the mere fact that his life was destroyed by this didn't matter to the members of government who had to keep a lid on this. Marcel's son, Jesse Jr., acknowledged his father's drinking problem in the wake of the crash, and also a problem his mother had. You know, the major was finally able to bring himself back from the brink of disaster, but not everybody else was so lucky. Elroy John Center, a chemist with the Battelle Memorial Institute, and a man who's believed to have secretly studied the debris found at Roswell, ended his days in a sanitarium, completely obsessed with UFOs, addicted to booze, and described as a shell of his former self. And then there's another individual I had the opportunity to meet years ago, Glenn Dennis, a mortician at Ballard's Funeral Home in Roswell in 1947. He claimed that right after the crash, he got a strange telephone call from the mortuary officer at the base, and he was asked about the availability of child-sized caskets that could be sealed hermetically. Well, Glenn Dennis signed a sworn affidavit confirming that a nurse friend at the base admitted to him that a preliminary autopsy of the bodies had been conducted at Roswell Army Airfield. According to the story, Dennis's nurse entered one particular room to collect some samples when she ran into a pair of doctors who were handling a gurney that had 3 small humanoid bodies on it. 2 of the bodies were damaged, as if wild animals that had been gnawing on them. Their heads were large, their mouths were mere slits. The nurse quickly realized they weren't human. Now, a great deal of debate has raged for years about the veracity of Glenn Dennis's tale and his nurse, who no one can identify. But that's not surprising, given that Dennis admitted to covering up her real name, preferring instead to give her a degree of anonymity. And understandably, this has given rise to the theory that he simply created the entire story. But there is data that points to a very different belief. L.M. Hall, a former chief of police in Roswell, went on record as stating that Dennis told him to store the caskets right at the time it happened in 1947. Sergeant Milton Sprouse, who served at the Roswell Army Airfield in 47, has also publicly confirmed that he heard Dennis's story decades ago. So if this is all true, what was the name of the nurse? Well, the most likely candidate is Miriam Bush, who wasn't really a nurse but an executive secretary at the base hospital in July of 47. She worked under the chief medical officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Warren. Now, Bush's surviving families admitted that in the summer of 47, she described to her parents her horror at seeing a number of small humanoid bodies in a particular room at the hospital. Now, unfortunately, we can't get vindication of the story from Bush herself. In the final days of 1989, Bush, who was a long-time alcoholic, also died. Now, there are those that said she killed herself, and there are those that told a different story. According to Pat Bush, who was married to Miriam's brother, George, she said Miriam was frightened her whole life over what she saw at the hospital on that day. According to Pat Bush, her sister-in-law's death was possibly not what it seemed to be. She actually said in 2010 it was far worse. According to Pat, just before her death, Miriam checked into a hotel room, or rather curiously used her sister's name and address instead of her own. She claimed that she was fearful that somebody was watching her. Now, if you'll remember from some of the other stories we've discussed, a lot of people involved in the UFO community feel that they're being watched and followed. And although the police stated her death was suicide, there were a lot of doubts that this might actually be the case. Miriam had bruises on her arms and a plastic bag over her head when she was found. It only amplified the family's suspicions. And let's not forget that Glenn Dennis went public with his story only months before Miriam Bush actually died. Maybe his revelation prompted somebody to have Miriam removed from the equation before she had a chance to speak openly about what she knew about Roswell. And there's another aspect to the number of deaths at Roswell. One that, if it's true, is terrifying in its implications. In the early 1990s, UFO researcher from Big Bear Lake named Timothy Cooper claimed contact with a wide and varied body of whistleblower-type figures in the world of government, the military, and even the intelligence community. The WikiLeaks group provided Cooper with hundreds of pages of reportedly classified documents on the Roswell incident. These documents talked about crashed UFOs, dead extraterrestrial, the alien autopsies, and a whole lot more. Now, the fact the documents exist is not in doubt. In fact, I've seen some of them. Now, whether they're a genuine article or some form of disinformation designed to confuse the truth about Roswell is a matter of some debate. But one thing we can be sure of is that two of the documents refer to mysterious and disturbing deaths at one of the sites that have become linked to the Roswell legend. Documents in question, known as the Interplanetary Phenomena Unit Summary of 1947 and the Majestic 12 First Annual Report, which is believed to date from sometime in the 1850s. Chronologically speaking, it's within the pages of these two documents that we learn about the alleged concern exhibited by the military and the government and the intelligence community in 47, and these alien beings represented a potential biological threat to the human race. According to the Interplanetary Phenomena Unit Summary, one section refers to deaths deep in the New Mexico desert, a site where some of the bodies were found. According to what it said, ground personnel from Sandia experienced some form of contamination resulting in the death of 3 technicians. And a 4th technician was ill. His status wasn't known at the time this was written. Autopsies were scheduled to be performed to determine the cause of death. Counterintelligence Corps, which is the organization that scared the crap out of so many people in those days, made appropriate security file entries and dossiers with cross-references for future review. Now, from the Majestic 12 First Annual Report document, biological warfare programs in the U.S. and the U.K. are in field test stages. A discovery of new virus and bacteria agents so lethal that serums derived from genetic research can launch medical science into unheard of fields of biology. Samples extracted from the bodies found in New Mexico have yielded new strains of a retrovirus not totally understood, but it gives promise of the ultimate biological weapon. The danger lies in the spread of airborne and bloodborne outbreaks of diseases in large populations, which has, with no medical cures available. And according to the document, the Majestic 12 organization was concerned over the contamination of several personnel who came in contact with debris near the power plant. One technician was overcome and collapsed when he attempted to remove a body. The medical technician went into a coma 4 hours after he put a body in a rubber body bag. And all 4, of course, are rushed to Los Alamos for observation. And all 4 died later of seizures and profuse bleeding. Now, the really scary part was all 4 were wearing protective suits when they came in contact with the body fluids of the occupants. Now, according to further data, autopsies on the 4 dead technicians are conclusive. It's believed that they may have suffered from some form of toxin or a highly contagious disease. Now, a possible connection to all this, while being interrogated by the military over his find at the Foster Ranch, Brazil was stripped bare and given a close and careful physical exam. Now, you have to wonder if this was done to determine if the rancher was displaying any physical signs of infection. But what infection were they looking for? Now, the very idea that a fast-acting lethal toxin or virus or plague of alien origins was unleashed in Lincoln County, New Mexico in the summer of '47 sounds like the stuff of science fiction. The script of a conspiracy-fueled science fiction drama. However, this scenario got far more than a passing degree of support from official documents that didn't surface publicly until about 10 years after Timothy Cooper's final stash of prominent papers appeared. In April of 2006, the FBI declassified information into public domain through a Freedom of Information Act request. And that included portions of a fascinating and illuminating document entitled Bacteriological Warfare in the U.S. that covers chiefly the late 40s up into the 1950s, which is arguably one of the most significant periods in UFO history. Notably, of the file's original 1,783 pages, over 1,074 were firmly withheld from declassification by the FBI. And the reason they gave for this was national security. Nevertheless, the 709 pages that were released into the public domain by the FBI have proven to be extremely valuable in helping to determine the full scale of the link between UFO crashes in New Mexico and alien viruses, and the extent to which biological and bacteriological warfare are considered matters of extreme concern from a national security perspective in the late 40s, and the secrecy that surrounded the subject at an official level during that same period of time. More significantly, the FBI file provided a strong, pervasive corroboration of certain key data contained within the pages of several of the documents leaked to investigator Cooper in the late 1990s. Extraordinarily, official declassification of these documents exists to show that the FBI was highly concerned about suspicious outbreaks of an exotic virus and diseases in that specific state of New Mexico in the late 40s, and specifically in none other than Lincoln County. The legendary UFO crash occurred. Of great significance is the fact that one of the cases UFO examined, which is described in a heavily redacted memo dated May 29, 1950, dealt with the summer 1940s outbreak of plague at a highly sensitive New Mexico installation, Sandia Base, which played a significant role in the research and development of the atomic bomb. Now, as we've discussed earlier, the technicians supposedly died or confronted by non-human bodies at one of the Roswell sites allegedly came from Sandia. And on top of that, As the FBI's official papers demonstrate, the curious outbreak of plague at the base was viewed in some quarters as being the result of nothing less than a deliberate attempt to clandestinely introduce widespread contagion on the Sandia base by hostile unknown sources. According to another of the so-called leaked documents, dated November 18, 1952, on December 6, 1950, UFO impacted the Earth at high speed at the El Indio Guerrero area of the Texas-Mexican border after following a long trajectory through the atmosphere. And by the time a search team arrived, what remains of the object had been almost totally incinerated. Such material as could be recovered was transported to the Atomic Energy Commission facility at Sandia, New Mexico, for study. Well, in the same year, that crashed UFO debris is retransferred to Sandia. An attempt was made by forces unidentified to devastate the base through the introduction of an unconventional biological warfare agent. Now, this may have been due to the clandestine activities of visited aliens who had already directly and indirectly killed a number of technicians present at the crash site in New Mexico. But it may not be as extreme as it sounds. Something of a biological warfare nature had occurred in New Mexico that subsequently led the FBI to devote countless agents, manpower, and expertise toward resolving what was taking place in the heart of New Mexico. And the FBI's concern only continued and worsened. As a perfect example of this ongoing concern, September 1949, according to a document entitled Biological Warfare in the United States, possibly some of you saw headlines in newspapers published in the States during August, such as Black Death stirs Albuquerque, Black Plague hits 2 in New Mexico, and Dark Age Plague found in 2. Well, it's interesting to note that the Black Plague, which came from the Middle Ages, is still with us. It's necessary that folks in public health and preventive medicine seriously consider plague and acquaint themselves with the plague of the day. Now, the FBI's emphasis was on the outbreak of exotic diseases in New Mexico during the late 40s. According to a number of reports, it quotes the words of the director of the New Mexico State Public Health Laboratory, who prepared a report on sudden suspicious eruptions of plagues in New Mexico. He wrote late on August 1st, 1949, a pathologist at the Veterans Hospital in Albuquerque called stating that a man from Placitas in Sandoval County had been admitted to the hospital. Clinical symptoms resembled that of plague. Now, the director noted that one of the few additional cases from New Mexico were reported in 1949, all suggestive of some form of plague being on the loose. He also informed the FBI, since this report was written, a 7.5-year-old boy in Lincoln County died, conceivably of the plague. He was taken to a physician at Fort Stanton on November 4th. Apparently wasn't in a very serious condition, was sent home. Went back to the Fort Stanton Hospital November 5th, his temperature being higher, and by noon he was worse, and by 2:30 he was dead. Postmortem examination was made, and the doctor in charge diagnosed the case as being bubonic plague, with pneumonic and septicemic complications. Now, there are 2 points with respect to this particular document that are of interest to us. First, Lincoln County, where the young boy lived and apparently contracted plague, was also the location of the Foster Ranch when Mac Brazil stumbled on a crashed UFO in July of 1947. That finding quickly opened up the floodgates on the Roswell controversy. And second, when the young boy was taken to Fort Stanton, according to the UFO researcher Martin Cannon, coincidentally otherwise, the Brazil Ranch is located quite near Fort Stanton Mesa. In World War II, soldiers suffering from combat fatigue and other psychological ailments were remanded to Fort Stanton. Researcher Kathy Caston visited Fort Stanton Mesa and toured the facility's cemetery, and she noted with great interest the sharp increase in deaths that took place from 1947 and 1951. Equally intriguing is the fact that the FBI also, during this same period, began to collect and review New Mexico-based newspaper articles on the sudden surfacing of serious and sometimes mysterious deadly diseases that took place within the state. Perfect example is an article the FBI got from the Albuquerque Journal dated June 21st, 1950, referring to a then recent two-day conference held at the Atlanta, Georgia-based Communicable Disease Center with public health workers who are conducting a survey on the plague problem in New Mexico. Now you have to ask yourself, why was the FBI not only collecting all this data, but classifying it as top secret? In June of 1950, they put it on a collection titled Biological Warfare, Espionage, Sabotage, the Bubonic Plague. Even more of a mystery is the highly illuminating fact that, as FBI documents demonstrate, all the previously mentioned data collected by the FBI on sudden outbreaks of plague in New Mexico, as well as information on the deaths at Fort Stanton, which was just a short distance from the Foster Ranch, was copied not only to the Director of Naval Intelligence, the Air Force Director of Special Investigations, the Acting Director of the Division of Security of the Atomic Energy Commission, and the Director of the CIA. Needless to say, the likelihood that these illustrious and high-ranking individuals would have normally displayed any interest in human deaths inadvertently caused by disease in New Mexico would seem to me to be highly unlikely, unless it was related to national security. And if, in fact, somebody had released bubonic plague, then certainly national security would have been involved. Now, from the Roswell incident, let's talk about disappearing planes and pilots. I'm referring specifically to U.S. Air Force pilot Captain Thomas Mantell, who died in 1948 while chasing UFO in the skies of Kentucky. Of course, the Air Force later said he was chasing a weather balloon or was chasing the planet Venus. If we've got pilots that can't tell the difference between the planet Venus and a UFO, we got a problem. There were quite a number of theories. Now, the facts, aside from what happened to him and what he encountered, are relatively straightforward. It all began in the afternoon of January 7th, 1948. Staff at the Kentucky-based Godwin Army Airfield, which is co-located with Fort Knox, noticed something that to them at least was strange. A highly reflective circular-shaped object hovering in the skies and in close proximity to the base. Now, according to reports, it was an enormous object. Control tower employees at Fort Knox, to include the resident intelligence officer, the base commander, and various high-ranking personnel, did their utmost to identify this mysterious visitor, and they all were unable to do so, despite keeping an eye on it for about an hour and a half. And given that UFOs have been big news for quite a number of months, ever since Kenneth Hudnall had his contact in June of '47 and the Roswell crash of something in July of 1947, there was an air of definite unease developed among those who were watching this object. Well, while Goodman Army Airfield was in a state of concern, the Squadron of 4 P-51 Mustang aircraft came over the horizon, commanded by Captain Thomas Mantell. And as his group approached Godman, they were ordered to try to identify that mystifying hovering thing in the sky. Now, you would have thought 4 air crews would have had no problem doing that, but almost immediately there was a problem. Those 4 aircraft became 1 aircraft. One of the planes, it turns out, was low on fuel, so it had to land at Godman Airfield. The second pilot, concerned there was something that happened to him, he became disoriented due to a lack of an oxygen mask, requested permission to break off and land, and he was given permission. As such was the level of concern that the pilot had, the decision was taken to have the third plane escort him to the ground. So in just a few minutes, Mantell's group went from 4 to 1. All alone, he was the only one left to check out the Enigma in the skies. And it was to be his last mission. Also be the last thing you do, period, besides dying. At about 15,000 feet, Mantell, who also didn't have an oxygen mask, radioed Godman, let him know he could see the object pretty clearly, and added it seemed to be moving at roughly 50% of his speed, which would put its speed at about 180 miles per hour. And he said this UFO was in fact huge in size, and he climbed about 25,000 feet, advising ground personnel he's going to attempt to get a closer look. And that was the last communication from Captain Mantell. Unknown object vanished, and more than 120 miles from Godman, Mantell's Mustang ceased its climb due to the rigors of high altitude exposure. And then it went into a dive, slammed into farmland with full pulverizing force, and Mantell, unsurprisingly, was killed instantly. Now, according to the official cause of his death, he passed out from a lack of sufficient oxygen and never came to. 25 years old. Now, was he a victim of his own carelessness? Or was his death a case of termination at the hands of whoever was flying the UFO? Now, it's generally considered unfair and incorrect to put the blame for Mantell's lack of professionalism for what happened. He was a man with thousands of air hours to his credit. Somebody who'd been decorated for his bravery during the Second World War. Now, clearly he saw something. He described it to the tower. But what was it he saw? Well, it's difficult to say with 100% certainty because within 30 minutes of the crash, the object had vanished, despite having hung in the skies for several hours. So an investigation was undertaken, and the investigation fell to the U.S. Air Force's official UFO study program. The Army Air Corps became the Air Force in '47. Project Sign was the study program. The official verdict at first was that Mantell had misperceived the planet Venus, assuming it to have been a smaller size object at relatively close quarters, rather than a heavenly body at a multi-million-mile distance. Now, that theory did have some merit, as Venus was in a general position to be seen. The problem was that on a January afternoon, it had been practically impossible to see the planet at all. There was another possibility, covered up by military secrecy. At that time, when UFOs were all the rage, the U.S. Navy's Office of Naval Research and Development was flying large balloons under cover of an operation called Project Skyhook. Now, those chiefly utilized to collect meteorological data, Skyhook and the intended project were deeply classified. As far as their appearance, they were in actuality reflective, just like the unknown object seen by Mantell. But it's unlikely that Mantell would have been aware of Project Skyhook and no particular need to know about its existence. And because Skyhook was such a secret project, it's not impossible that Project Sign staff found themselves in a deep quandary. If they suspected a Skyhook balloon was the culprit, revealing that would have compromised a classified operation. That's something that may have led to the initial promotion of the Venus theory instead. Now, there truly may have been a cover-up behind Mantell's death, not because of a direct flying saucer themed angle, but because of the problem with the Skyhook theory. Well, in 1952, the Mantell affair once again fell under official scrutiny. Investigating officer Captain Edward Ruppelt was the head of Project Blue Book, the Air Force's successor to Project Sign, and quite frankly, a major cover-up. Prior to that was Project Grudge, which Rupert also worked on. Rupert didn't rule out the balloon theory. It made a great deal of sense. And try as he might, though, with all his door-opening abilities, when it would uncover any documentation that proved that the whole thing was provoked by a disaster case of mistaken identity. He had more than a few choice words of criticism to say about the Air Force's conclusion on the encounter and the subsequent death of Mantell. He said, to use a trite term, it was a masterpiece in the art of weasel wording. He said that the UFO might have been Venus, or it could have been a balloon, maybe two balloons. Possibly it was Venus, except that it's doubtful because Venus too dim to be seen in the afternoon. Now, he died in 1960, Edward Rupert, of a heart attack at a very young age of 37. And one of many UFO-related people who died of heart attacks. Now, on the matter of fatal aircraft crashes in the 40s, and specifically with UFO connections, it's worth noting the words of retired Sergeant Rita Hill of the British Royal Air Force. She spent a lot of the late 1940 military career at a RAF base in the English county of Wiltshire called Boscombe Down, from where new and radically designed experimental aircraft are being tested on. In 1998, she said something that should be kept in mind when you consider the circumstances surrounding the death of Captain Mantell. She said, with the UFOs, I'll tell you what I can, but it's all top secret at the time. When test pilots finished their tests, they would have briefings, which her personnel would attend. And these were all very hush-hush. Sometimes the pilots would report seeing strange lights and objects in the sky. They didn't call them UFOs at the time. But they would say that when they saw these strange things, the instruments on the aircraft would go haywire, and sometimes the altimeter would just stop. She said there were always crashes with experimental aircraft, and these weren't biplanes. We're talking about jets and so forth. At times, they'd have a crash a week, and she was in charge of a crash crew, and she had two individuals with her. And when they went to a crash site, everything had to be found, even the buttons off the tunics. Sometimes it would take weeks to find everything, and from there, the records would be taken for reconstruction. In those cases, reports went to the Air Ministry at Whitehall in London, and it would all be sworn to secrecy. It's only now that she said anything about what she saw. Now, one man with intimate knowledge of the death of Captain Thomas Mantell was Captain James Dusler, Deputy Commander at Godman Air Force Base on the day that Mantell lost his life. And his testimony is important, as he was one of the first-hand witnesses to the unusual object in the sky, likened its shape to an ice cream cone standing on its head. Only that, there seemed to be a dark-colored band around the object when it was rotating incredibly fast. The lower section was red, something that is a deep variant to the description of the skyhook balloon. And significantly, Dusler said that less than 12 hours after Mantell's death, another UFO was seen at Godman. About 1 o'clock in the morning the next day, one initial safe craft of unknown origins and giving off an orange glow was seen moving in a wide arc around the base. They never determined what that was. And then there are the comments that Dusler made about Mantell's body. Despite the fact the aircraft had plummeted to the ground from a height of tens of thousands of feet, and although each and every one of his bones was shattered, there wasn't even a cut or a scratch on his skin. The aircraft wasn't at all badly damaged, although the wings were broken off the craft of an impact. And in his view, was not consistent with what one would expect to find in an aircraft to hit the ground both speed and force. So you have to ask yourself, what was it consistent with? That's a question everybody involved in the affair would like to have answered. Was it Venus, a secret balloon, or a genuine UFO? They still don't have an answer to that. Now, when you're talking about what I call the UFO murders, one of the most important was that of James Forrestal, the first U.S. Secretary of Defense. At 1:50 in the morning, on May 22nd, 1949, his life came to an end. The battered body of James Forrestal was found lying on the third-floor canopy of the Maryland-based Bethesda Naval Hospital. According to the story, he threw himself out of a window on the 16th floor. He fell 13 floors. So it scares some of these mentioning, but death was probably instantaneous. Now, it would seem logical to assume that he took his own life. After all, as under record, he was severely depressed at the time. was deeply bothered by the burden of a mountain of government secrets and was heavily medicated for anxiety. But that assumption may well be wrong. His death might have had less to do with depression and more a case of cold-blooded murder. Something prompted by fears the Secretary of Defense was on the verge of revealing to the world what he secretly knew about the UFO phenomenon. I have read earlier reports of him running down through the halls of his office complex, yelling about aliens invasion. But before we get to the matter of all things extraterrestrial, let's take a little bit of a look at James Vincent Forrestal. Born in Dutchess County, New York, 1892. Went to Princeton. When he left there, he found employment with William A. Reed and Company, a force on Wall Street. And thanks to his skills in the field of banking and investment, he soon secured a sizable amount of money. At the age of 34, he married Josephine Ogden, a writer for Vogue. It was a difficult marriage, given that both Ogden and Forrestal had emotional issues. She suffered from mood swings and an alcohol addiction. And he was one of these type of people that finds it difficult to get close to people and rarely showed his feelings about anything. In 1940, he secured a position with the U.S. government and in a short period of time was offered a job of Undersecretary of the Navy. Well, he accepted that job. Within a few years, he became the full Secretary of the Navy. Then in 1947, in conjunction with the historic passing of the National Security Act, he was made the first Secretary of Defense by President Harry S. Truman. It wasn't long, though, before the pressures of a prestigious but responsibility-filled job began to take their toll on the man. Depression took an unrelenting grip on Forrestal. In 1949, amid official concerns, he was unstable, erratic, and even a risk to national security. He was stripped of his position. His diaries that ran to thousands of pages, many of which are still remain outside the public view to this day, were given to the White House for what was described as safekeeping. And finally, and most certainly against his own volition, he was admitted to Bethesda for what was said to be his own safety and his own good. And the rest, of course, became history. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. It all depends on whose versions of history you want to believe. Prior to being admitted to Bethesda on April 2nd, 1949, he feared he was being watched by shadowy sources. He wasn't sure if they were foreign or domestic. But remember what I said earlier, so many people who wind up coming to a sad end in regard to UFOs report feeling watched. He developed a significant degree of paranoia as he began to see spying eyes in all quarters. Maybe it was like agents of the Soviet KGB that were following it, in an effort to learn certain high-level secrets about the U.S. government. Or maybe it was the FBI, keeping a watch to ensure he didn't crack up and start spewing classified data. Or maybe it was the mysterious MIBs. Well, he was committed to Bethesda, placed in what amounted to solitary confinement in a room with heavily screened windows. When he asked the reason for the screens, the chief of psychiatrist, Captain George Raines, told him in uncertain terms it was to keep him from jumping out the window. Then asked him, given what happened to Forrestal on May 22nd, he told Raines in the most appalled fashion he wouldn't even begin to imagine committing suicide by jumping to his death. He was made of stronger stuff than that. And although there was no doubt that he was indeed in a fragile psychological state when he entered Bethesda, he was trying to throw himself out of the car that took him to the hospital. By all accounts, his condition improved significantly over the course of the next few weeks. Just 2 days before his death, he was seen happily chatting with Bethesda's commanding officer, Rear Admiral Morton Wolcott. Forrestal was described as lucid and freshly showered, had a healthy appetite, as evidenced by the steak he ate in the Wolcott's company. Everything was moving nicely forward until 2 days later when he allegedly committed suicide. It's also when things got decidedly murky and mysterious. Officially accepted versions of events is that Forrestal, in the hours leading up to that fatal moment, was in his room under the watchful eye of Edward Preece, a U.S. Navy corpsman, with whom Forrestal got along very well. Forrestal reportedly told Preece he didn't want to set it that night, he intended to read. After Preece's shift was over at midnight, Robert Wayne Harrison Jr. took his place and kept watch over the Secretary of Defense. Or at least he did for a while, and then he exited the room to run an errand, at which point, according to the story, Forrestal became distraught, tied one end of a cord of his dressing gown to the room's radiator, which was directly below the room's window, put the other end around his neck, and jumped out the window. The cord gave away under his weight, and he fell to his death. Rather than dying by hanging, which may have been his original plan if you accept the suicide theory. But there are a number of reasons why we shouldn't necessarily embrace the notion Forrestal took his own life. Not only was his psychological state vastly improved by May 22nd, but he made firm plans with Preece to have Preece become his personal chauffeur when he got released from Bethesda. And that was a position that Preece was looking forward to fulfilling as the two had developed a great rapport and even a degree of friendship. And on top of that, on the very day that Forrestal died, his brother Henry, angry and concerned that Forrestal was essentially being held against his will, made it known he was going to come to Bethesda to have Forrestal removed from being confined there. He informed the hospital staff in advance he's going to take his brother home, which apparently was not a wise decision. If there was one time more than any other that somebody might have wanted Forrestal dead, it was surely when it seemed likely he was due to leave Bethesda and be totally free of the Navy's watch and control. And if Forrestal did die, and only hours before he was due to exit Bethesda, only heightened the suspicion his death was not a suicide. And then there's the matter of why Forrestal was actually left alone in his room after being watched so closely. Other conflicting versions of events, one suggested that Forrestal ordered his guard to run the errand as a means to ensure that Forrestal was left alone to commit his fatal act without anybody present to stop him. Second scenario has the guard being called out of the room and the deed being undertaken by assassins while Forrestal was alone. And then there's the controversial issue of the dressing gown cord found wrapped around his neck. Now, this was a cord designed to be around Forrestal's waist to hold the dressing gown closed. And it seems highly unlikely that such a cord had been long enough to ensure that one end could be tied up around the radiator and allow for the other end to be wrapped around his neck and still permit enough cord to be left over so he could climb out the window. And related to this is the fact that when the outside wall was examined after Forrestal's death, there was clear evidence of scratch marks directly below the window, which suggests that Forrestal in his final seconds was struggling and fighting for his life. And then we have the words of Henry Forrestal, who became utterly convinced his brother had been murdered. For Henry, his brother was throttled with the cord and thrown out the window by unseen forces. It was a belief that Henry held on to for the rest of his life. Well, whatever the ultimate cause of Forrestal's death, there are a number of reasons why the cause of his mental collapse may have been prompted by something other than UFOs. After all, his passing occurred less than 5 years after the end of the Second World War, at a time when civilization was very much in a state of flux. On top of that, having defeated the Nazis less than 5 years before, the world now faced with the Soviet menace and its growing flexing muscles. And Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense, was overwhelmed by matters of national security on a daily basis. So the question becomes, did he commit suicide? And if so, what led to it? Well, go back to the title of this segment, UFO Murders Part 2. On that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow, and once again, we'll be talking more about UFOs and some of the mysteries. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a truly great evening.